Hello and welcome back to my channel and to a series on my channel called Always Have, Always Will. And today we're going to be talking about the Say Her Name campaign and including Black women in the conversation we're having about state violence. So this episode of Always Have, Always Will is going to focus on the experiences of Black women and discussing why we're not really centered in conversations about police brutality and about anti-Black violence. The reason that I was kind of inspired to make this video personally is at protests and online as well, I've been seeing the proliferation of the use of hashtags like say his name and say their names, or even the use of say her name in reference to women who aren't Black. In short, stop this. We are already able to list off a lot of Black men's names more readily than we can for Black women who have suffered and died unjustly. Additionally, for women who aren't Black, or for anyone who is not a Black woman, there are other ways that we can rally for justice for them without encroaching on Say Her Name, which is something that was specifically crafted for Black women. If you're not familiar with this movement or even this phrase, Say Her Name is a movement specifically geared towards the inclusion of Black women in conversations about police violence. Launched in December 2014 by the African American Policy Forum and Center for Intersectionality and Social Policy Studies, the hashtag Say Her Name campaign brings awareness to the often invisible names and stories of Black women and girls who have been victimized by racist police violence and provides support to their families. And that description of the beginning of the Say Her Name campaign is from the African American Policy Forum website, and I'll have that linked below with all of my sources. And the next source that I'm going to read from is from an interview with Kimberly Crenshaw. And Kimberly Crenshaw, if you've heard the term intersectionality, I'm going to make a video about that and the Combahee River Collective Statement at some point. But I'll flash like a little definition of the term intersectionality. Kimberly Crenshaw is the mind who coined that term. She's also a professor of law, and she's the co-founder and executive director of the AAPF. So, like I said, this next source is an interview with her about the Say Her Name movement. Say Her Name is an effort to challenge the way we think and talk about racial justice so that it becomes far more gender inclusive. We were inspired to start Say Her Name while protesting the Eric Garner grand jury decision. Protesters were calling out the names of Black men who had been killed by the police, but Black women who had died in similar circumstances were not mentioned. We began saying the names of these Black women. We began chanting, Say Her Name. It soon transformed from a Twitter hashtag into a movement. Our goal is to break the silence around state violence against women of color. So now that we've established the origin of this specific movement, the Say Her Name campaign, I'm going to show you a couple of video clips to give you an idea of the motivations and goals beyond what you've already heard. The first one is from a TED Talk that Kimberly Crenshaw gave called The Urgency of Intersectionality, and the second one is a video from the African American Policy Forum that I think gives a face to what this movement stands for. I do want to issue a content warning for the second video. I'll see if I can put in timestamps so you can kind of skip. There is graphic content, so do be aware of that.
It's time for a change. So what can we do? In 2014, the African American Policy Forum began to demand that we say her name at rallies, at protests, at conferences, at meetings, anywhere and everywhere that state violence against Black bodies is being discussed.
There is growing outrage tonight after an unarmed African-American teenager was shot and killed by police in the city.
Police violence against Black women is very real. Why is it that their lost lives don't generate the same amount of media attention and communal outcry as the lost lives of their fallen brothers?
There is a lack of acknowledgement of the violence that Black women face at the hands of the state, both from people who understand that Black women are subject to this violence and those who refute the idea that police brutality and anti-Black violence are Black women's issues. Working through this personally from my own perspective, the assertion that Black women are less likely to be harmed or killed by the police could stem, I think, from the sexist and misguided idea that women don't pose as much of a threat as men. And there I would argue two things. Number one, due to the historical masculinization of Black women to the point where a core stereotype of Black women is that they are like men, as well as the perception of Blackness as a deadly weapon regardless of gender, I would argue that Black women are seen as a threat. And secondly, even if police didn't see Black women as a threat, I don't think that being threatened is the only reason that people, especially people in power, choose to enact violence against others. So even if police or vigilantes do see Black women as less of a threat, that doesn't necessarily make them less likely to inflict harm, because acts of anti-Black violence are about asserting power, not just feeling threatened. First, we're going to explore the fact that Black women are in fact targeted by police and face similar kinds of violence as Black men, as well as gender-specific forms of violence. This next source is a video from an account called For Harriet, run by Kimberly Nicole Foster, who is really great. Ever since I found her channel, I feel like my politics have grown in a really positive way. I really highly recommend her channel. I think this is the 10-year anniversary of her running this channel. So yeah, I wanted to give kind of an overview of this topic from someone who's been doing this kind of work for a lot longer than I have, and I think she does a really good job of summarizing in this video.
This is why I strongly encourage people not to use say their name or say his name. So in 2014, the African American Policy Forum, headed in part by Kimberly Crenshaw, you might know her as the woman who coined and theorized the term intersectionality, they created the hashtag Say Her Name to highlight how narratives about police violence often exclude Black women and Black girls. But that is not right. We know that Black women and Black girls experience police violence. We experience it in similar ways as Black men, but we also experience it in different ways, like we are often sexually assaulted by police officers. We are stalked and harassed by police officers, right? So we are still feeling the effects of the prison industrial complex. That is also why I really bristle when people say that this fight to abolish prisons and abolish policing is just to the benefit of Black men. No, it is not. And Black women say this. No, it is not. No, it is not. If you are a Black woman, if you are a Black trans person, a Black non-binary person, the police are just as invested in harassing you and violating you and traumatizing you and terrorizing you as they are other people. So that's why I have a deep investment in deconstructing these systems.
Something I appreciate about what she says here is that Black women are also participating in our own erasure. I feel like it is so common for the narrative to be that Black men and Black boys will say they fear for their lives, and then Black women and girls will say, oh, I fear for my father, I fear for my brother, I fear for my son, not that we fear for ourselves. And sometimes, I mean, I understand that this comes from, you know, being conditioned to think this way, and we'll get into that a little bit later, but I feel like sometimes this narrative being the only narrative makes me feel a little bit gaslit because I'm terrified of the police. And so when other Black women act in ways that suggest that we are not at risk as well, it makes me feel like somehow those feelings that I have are invalid or unfounded, when in fact, as we're going to see from the sources I'm about to show, they're not. The next source is really important. It's a report called Say Her Name, Resisting Police Brutality Against Black Women, and it was put together by the African American Policy Forum and the Center for Intersectionality and Social Policy Studies, and it shines a light on the trends in the ways that Black women and girls experience policing, and also documents specific stories of Black women and girls who have been killed by police. The erasure of Black women is not purely a matter of missing facts. Even where women and girls are present in the data, narratives framing police profiling and lethal force as exclusively male experiences lead researchers, the media, and advocates to exclude them. For example, Although racial profiling data are rarely, if ever, disaggregated by gender and race, when race and gender are considered together, researchers find that for both men and women, there is an identical pattern of stops by race or ethnicity. In New York City, one of the jurisdictions with the most extensive data collection on police stops, the rates of racial disparities in stops, frisks, and arrests are identical for Black men and Black women. However, the media, researchers, and advocates tend to focus only on how profiling impacts Black men. A really sad thing about this movement is that I've seen a lot of accusations that Black women divide the movement when we choose to call for justice for Black women and girls. And even in the interview that I read, the interview with Kimberly Crenshaw, she said that some responses to this campaign have been that it undermines the focus on Black men and boys. I think it's hard to see claims that Black women and girls are not targeted and harmed by police at the same rates, and this passage clearly shows that that's not true, because we are. And I definitely think that it is an invalid argument to say that we're undermining a focus on Black men and boys, because if we're being hurt too, if even one Black woman or girl is harmed by police, we should be talked about too. It should be understood how we experience that violence too. And I feel like it's not productive to kind of try and have this as a competition between Black men and Black women. I think we can talk about all of us, we can include all of us, so that we get a better outcome. Black women are disproportionately at risk for domestic violence, sexual abuse, and death at the hands of family members, partners, and people they know. A 2014 Time magazine article revealed that they are almost 3 times more likely to experience death as a result of domestic violence than are white women. While they comprise only 7% of the population, Black women make up 22% of domestic violence homicides. In fact, a leading cause of death of African American women ages 15 to 34 is homicide at the hands of a current or former intimate partner. Even when Black women do turn to the police for support, they often fail to secure safety from their abusive partners. More disturbingly, an alarming number of police killings of Black women take place in the context of police response to domestic violence situations. Similarly, Black women's experiences of sexual or homophobic and transphobic violence, leading to the deaths of at least 10 transgender women nationally in the first few months of 2015 alone, and a total of at least 12 deaths in 2014, have failed to result in protection or prevention. The reflexive criminalization of Black women seems at times to heighten the perception that they are threatening, foreclosing the possibility in police officers' minds that they are simply survivors of violence. Black women survivors of violence, and particularly poor, lesbian, gender nonconforming, and transgender Black women, find that police responses to violence all too often result in further and sometimes deadly violence against them. I do want to explore why it is that we leave women out of these conversations even when we do know that they experience similar violence. And I think that one explanation is that maybe we don't want to examine the harm that we do to Black women and Black queer people in our own community, because I think to grapple with this instance of violence against Black women might force some people to reckon with the fact that oftentimes heterosexual cisgender Black men, the ones that we're supposed to center in these conversations and hold up and protect, are the ones enacting violence against us, enacting domestic violence against us, enacting homophobic or transphobic killings against Black women and Black queer people. The harm that we do to each other is something that I think prevents us from having these conversations. I think of Oluwatoyin Salau and her activism and then her death. And the response that I saw, at least, was generally that we didn't do enough to protect her and to keep her safe. And I think that that is true. But I also think that, while Toyin's case is not one of police violence necessarily, I think that the housing insecurity that she faced contributed the circumstances leading to her death, which absolutely would make it state-sanctioned violence. Another important point from the excerpt that I read from the Say Her Name report is that because of preconceived notions or opinions or stereotypes about Black women, we can be criminalized or brutalized, not only for nothing, like in the cases of Breonna Taylor, and 7-year-old Ayanna Stanley Jones, who was killed while she was sleeping. These cases in particular, I think, are compelling because they debunk the suggestion that maybe if Black people behave in a certain way, we won't be killed, but we can be killed even when we're doing absolutely nothing. But also, in addition to that, we can be killed for asking for help. An entirely hidden dimension of police violence against Black women is reflected in victim reports of sexual abuse perpetrated by officers. The Cato Institute's 2010 annual report on police misconduct found that sexual misconduct was the second most common form of misconduct reported throughout 2010, after excessive force, with 618 officers involved in sexual misconduct complaints during that period, 354 of which were involved in complaints that involved forcible, non-consensual sexual activity, such as sexual assault or sexual battery. When the existing, though limited, data on police sexual assault are compared to FBI crime statistics, the results indicate that sexual assault rates are significantly higher for police when compared to the general population. The uneven power dynamic between an officer and his victim, combined with the officer's possible belief that since he is the law, he is above the law, have been hypothesized as root causes of this type of police abuse. Black women are particularly vulnerable to sexual assault by police due to historically entrenched presumptions of promiscuity and sexual availability. Historically, the American legal system has not protected Black women from sexual assault, thereby creating opportunities for law enforcement officials to sexually abuse them with the knowledge that they are unlikely to suffer any penalties for their actions. Unfortunately, there is no official data on how often police officers commit these crimes. Existing studies are largely based on media coverage, criminal convictions, and civil cases. The lack of data collection by police departments and civilian oversight bodies is compounded by the underreporting of sexual assaults in general. Victims are even less likely to report the crime if the assailant is a police officer. The women are terrified, says Penny Harrington, the former police chief of Portland, Oregon. Who are they going to call? It's the police who are abusing them. Sexual harassment and assault have been reported to be particularly pervasive during traffic stops and interactions with minors. It is also reported to take place with alarming frequency in the context of responses to requests for assistance or investigation of domestic violence or sexual assault. Second most common form of police misconduct, and yet there's no official data on how often the police commit these crimes. The trends reported here are extremely alarming and yet still do not get the attention that they deserve. I think that is due large in part to the fact that misogyny, rape culture, and patriarchy are all alive and well. Most women are not believed when they come forward about sexual assault, and Black women are even more likely to be mistrusted, especially when levying complaints against police officers who are in positions of power. The next source that I have to show you is called From Slavery to Jane Crow to Say Her Name, an intersectional examination of Black women and punishment, and it's a really cool academic source that traces the activism of Black women from the 19th century to present day, and also looks at the treatment of Black women within the criminal legal system. This passage discusses specific Black women and girls, confirming that we need to bear witness to the violence that Black women face and include them in our conversations about securing justice. While there is little to no scholarly research on the recent deaths of Black women at the hands of the criminal justice system, these cases have garnered national attention. Black women across the country, including Sandra Bland, Kendra Chapman, Joyce Cornell, Ralkina Jones, Alexis McGovern, and Raynetta Turner, as well as countless others that have not received national media attention, were all found hanged in their jail cells, a fate which presumably could have been avoided had they received social and legal protection. 7-year-old Ayanna Stanley Jones, who was killed by the police in a raid, received no legal justice whatsoever. The police officer responsible was not punished for her death, which could have been avoided. Rakia Boyd, Marissa Alexander, and an egregiously countless list of women and girls of color abused by state-sanctioned violence continue to illustrate the need for social, political, and legal attention. Their names need to be heard. The narrative of justice in the United States must incorporate the collective narratives of Black girls and women who continue to face social and legal injustices in this country, and direct action needs to be taken, and taken now. So, coming at this issue from an understanding that Black women and girls do experience police and state violence, why do we still leave them out of the conversation? I didn't read any of the parts from the last source that discuss Black women's activism, but this is something that I wanted to speak about briefly. It could really be its own video. In fact, this is a rich enough topic that I took an entire course related to this. When I had my Black Women in U.S. History course, a lot of what we talked about was the history of Black women's activism and the erasure that came along with that work. So I just want to talk about the fact that historically, the lack of attention paid to Black women in this moment is consistent with social justice movements in history. So Black women's work, as well as our lives, have historically been erased in ways similar to what we're seeing now. And a common narrative that I think we see about Black women right now, a common kind of like call to action is that Black women advocate for everybody else. So why doesn't everybody else advocate for Black women? The source that I'm going to talk about next is a scholarly article from 1999, and it's called The Role of the Black Women in the Black Liberation Movement and the Women's Movement and on to Transnational Feminism. And it details the history of erasure that I'm talking about. Accommodation and resistance are two strands that run through Black history, and it is in the resistance category that Black women will be discussed. In the 60s, as in world history, the Black woman was in the forefront of the struggle for civil rights and human dignity, yet very few people are familiar with the legion of courageous Black women. In more recent times, who can forget the spirit of Rosa Parks when she refused to move to the back of the bus, setting off the Montgomery bus boycott? Just this month, April 1999, at the age of 86, the U.S. Senate voted 86-0 to award her with Congress's highest civilian award, the Congressional Gold Medal. The bill authorizing the award states, "Her quiet dignity ignited the most significant social movement in the history of the United States." True or not, it was an extremely important movement. The Montgomery bus boycott of 1955-56 is viewed by many scholars as the first major event in the Black freedom struggles of the 50s and 60s. It propelled Martin Luther King Jr. to national prominence. But for a boycott to be successful, tremendous behind-the-scenes organizing and physical energy is required. In the years prior to the boycott, the most active and assertive Black civic group in Montgomery had been the Women's Political Council, headed by Mrs. Joanne Robinson, then a professor at Alabama State College. It was Mrs. Robinson, aided by friends and a number of Women's Political Council members, who were the heroines of the famed Montgomery bus boycott. These women took crucial actions in the hours immediately following Mrs. Parks' arrest to actually set a boycott in motion. Mrs. Robinson was the instigator of the boycott. She worked on the Committee of 100, which refers to the women who organized and participated in the transportation of Montgomery residents during the boycott. The Black women did it. Fannie Lou Hamer and Unita Blackwell are but two of the Mississippi women who braved attack and death in their fight to gain the right to vote. Longtime activist Ella Baker was responsible for the founding of the SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Thousands of Black women were involved on the civil rights movement and played important roles in raising the consciousness of the whole nation to the existing racist conditions in the South. Black women, for the most part, have been participants in daily labor outside of the home, as well as having the responsibility for home and family life. Struggle was a way of life. In addition to racist struggles, Black women had to contend with the underlying macho philosophy of the civil rights Black power movement. Being told to sit at home and to have babies for the revolution and not to become involved in political struggle did not have a place in organizations and groups serious about bringing an end to exploitation and oppression in the USA. This was not only theoretically unsound, it was even in direct contradiction to the reality of Black women's lives, both historically and at present. As a result of demeaning experiences suffered in the movement, many Black women began to protest and eventually broke away. Older women in particular became peers and teachers to the young. In 1970, Todi Cade Bambara published an anthology, The Black Woman, in which 27 women writers expressed the rising demand by women for liberation from their chattel-like roles in a male-dominated society. Significantly, most of the contributors had backgrounds in the civil rights Black power movement. I think this source does a really good job of showing the kinds of political work that Black women were doing, in addition to being expected to perform the domestic labor and essentially being reduced to their roles in continuing the Black family, so that role being reproduction. And I think that this source also does well to demonstrate kind of the way that Black women broke away from the Black power and civil rights movements because of the narrative that they were being told, which was to lift up and protect and focus on Black men, specifically heterosexual cisgender Black men, because I do want to say that I feel like Toni McDade's case was not talked about nearly enough. But so Black women broke away because of that idea that it was the Black man who needed to be lifted up, and that otherwise, if Black women wanted to talk about themselves and what they were experiencing, they were shut down and they were told that they were dividing the movement somehow. I think a really prime example of this is the fact that a lot of people don't know 3 queer Black women founded Black Lives Matter, and it's the way that this movement, this present day movement, is used almost exclusively to talk about the fate of Black men and boys, similar to the Black power and civil rights movements that were discussed in this source. This next scholarly article highlights the significance of intersectionality in the fight for justice. In addition to uncovering histories of African American women's activism, a growing body of work within Black women's history, Black gender studies, and Black queer studies is the exploration of Black women and girls, trans people, and queer people as victims of anti-Black state violence. In a moment in which activists, artists, Black communities, and scholars grapple with the white domestic terror lineage that extends from Emmett Till to recent victims of anti-Black state violence such as Trayvon Martin, Tamir Rice, Eric Garner, and Michael Brown, a Black, masculine-centered narrative of contemporary anti-Black racial violence emerges. The names of women and girls such as Tarika Wilson, Pearlie Golden, Rakia Boyd, Tanisha Anderson, Ayanna Jones, Renisha McBride, and Yvette Smith remain unknown to most people. Their stories, and more specifically, their fatal experiences with white police and security officers and vigilantes, disrupt a masculinist framing of anti-Black state violence. Knowing their names and stories compels conversations and activism surrounding anti-Black state violence to wrestle with how gender and sexuality affect how we mobilize and organize for racial justice. Furthermore, using an intersectional approach to addressing Black violability opens our collective eyes to multiple dimensions of state and state-sanctioned anti-Black violence. A broader, more inclusive approach would allow us to see the 13 African American women accusing Officer Daniel Holtzclaw of sexual assault as victims warranting our outrage, support, and organizational efforts. A Herstorical approach to anti-Black state violence encompasses the range of violence and violation Black people experience. The racial justice activism of foremothers such as Ida B. Wells and Rosa Parks provide a Herstorical foundation for including Holtzclaw's victims in our racial justice-centered activism. Both Parks and Wells understood interracial rapes and sexual assaults against Black women as distinct and important acts of anti-Black state and state-sanctioned violence. These women and many other women understood sexual violence and lynching as powerfully interconnected forms of racial terror. So the presence of a largely masculinist understanding of what state violence looks like is certainly an explanation for why state violence against Black women doesn't make headlines. Instances of Black women being harmed by the police don't stick in people's minds the same way that violence against Black men does. Because when there's an established narrative, it's a lot easier for us to hold those mentally than it is for when we hear something that maybe we haven't heard before, we think that that's an outlier. And this next article was written by Brittany Cooper for Time, and it's called Why Are Black Women and Girls Still an Afterthought in Our Outrage Over Police Violence? And it offers a couple of arguments that could explain this. So one suggestion offered up in this piece is specifically about why Breonna Taylor's case did not garner similar national and global outrage and attention as that of George Floyd. And the argument here is that Breonna Taylor's death was not caught on a video. To blame this lack of public focus on a lack of video is disingenuous, given that the Black Lives Matter movement exploded in the wake of two killings for which there was no filmed evidence, those of Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown. Instead, there is an extant narrative that helps us understand, even if uncomfortably, why Black men keep getting killed. That narrative also allows for other actors besides Black male victims and cops who kill. In late May in Central Park, when Christian Cooper took a video of Amy Cooper threatening to call the cops on him, an African-American man, the lynching script of lying white women putting Black men in mortal danger for their own nefarious purposes flashed before our eyes. The murder of George Floyd merely confirmed what Black people have always known, and what Amy Cooper demonstrated that plenty of white people know too, that the cops routinely harm Black people for the thinnest of reasons or no reasons at all. So this is kind of what I was talking about. We know this narrative. We know this narrative of a white woman lying to implicate a Black man. The next argument that Cooper introduces is the argument that femininity might protect us from police harm, but that is not the case. But at no point in our replaying of the lynching script, what with its accreting Black male victims, overzealous cops, and devious white women, do we ever think about how Black women fit into the story? Femininity is a weapon only if you're white. Black women have no such protections. Breonna Taylor's boyfriend tried to take care of his partner, but could not. We keep missing the intersection of race and gender when it comes to Black women, but right there at that intersection stands a 17-year-old Black girl named Darnella Frazier. She filmed George Floyd's murder. Like Ida B. Wells before her, she bore witness to the extralegal killing of a Black man and made sure the world heard the story. For her trouble, she experienced online harassment from people who wondered why she didn't do more. I wonder why Derek Chauvin's colleagues didn't do more. So again, the importance of intersectionality is key. If we just think about the injustices impacting Black men, and then in the terms of like the women's movement, we just think about the injustices facing white women, we still miss a lot in terms of serving justice for those at the intersections. In this next clip, Andrea Ritchie of the Barnard Center for Research on Women expounds this idea.
Earlier in the show, just before this segment, we heard a discussion about Raceyard Brooks' case in Atlanta. This happened on Friday. Already that officer has been fired. There's talk of criminal charges against him. Breonna Taylor was killed 3 months ago. The officers are still on the force. They're on this administrative reassignment. And as far as we know publicly, the investigation has had very little movement, very little public movement. What do you make of that difference?
I definitely think that it has to do with how we see and understand state violence and who it impacts and how it's impacted. I think it also has to do with the jurisdiction. I mean, it's long past time for those officers to be fired, and it's long past time for her family to receive the reparations and healing that they're owed and deserved. I think part of it is about how we understand state violence. I think our understanding of state violence is shaped by the experiences of Black men like Raceyard, who are perceived to be the sort of quintessential targets from the time of lynching to the time of the present, and that the experiences of women of gender-based violence are kind of shaped by our understanding of white women experiencing domestic violence in the home. And as a result, Black women who experience both state and violence in the home are left out of both narratives, and we literally don't see them, even when the violence is happening to them in front of us.
This next reading accompanies audio of another interview with Kimberly Crenshaw. I'll just read you some highlights, but I would highly recommend giving it a listen. I think it was about 5 minutes, so it's really short, and it'll be linked below. There's a long history of sidelining Black women's lived experiences, and it may be hard to conceptualize anti-Black violence against women because of the historical emphasis on Black men's stories, she says. During slavery in the United States, Black women endured endless labor, sexual assault, and being torn away from their children. Black men also bore inhumane treatment during slavery, but oftentimes their stories became the center narrative, Crenshaw says. For our entire history of slavery and efforts to challenge it, the way that it's experienced by men has been at the center of it, she says. And that has created a narrative about what anti-Black racism looks like. That is accurate, but it is not entirely inclusive. The overwhelming response to Floyd's killing was in part because it's amplifying what we know racism to have been about, Crenshaw says. Many people don't have the framework to conceptualize the racist violence towards Black women because their stories have historically been erased or ignored, she says. We don't tell the stories about the disrespect that Black women experienced. So not too surprisingly, when the police treat Black women in ways that are continuous with that legacy, we don't have the stories, she says. So this echoes what a few of the other sources have said about the way that we understand racial violence being a barrier to acknowledging and including women who have and continue to suffer from it. And if you start reading Black feminist theory, you will see immediately this conflict that a lot of Black women thinkers will write about, which is being asked to choose Blackness or womanhood, which comes first for you. But again, this is erasure. We need to represent and center the Black women's experience to reshape our collective understanding of what racism is and how it can manifest. It's not just about the ways that we see it manifest for Black men. So why is it important that we include Black women in the conversation? Well, we need to include Black women and girls because if we want Black lives to matter, it has to be all Black lives. So we need to show that our lives matter too, that Black women and girls' lives matter too. Including Black women and girls in police violence and gender violence discourses sends the powerful message that indeed all Black lives matter. If our collective outrage around cases of police violence is meant to serve as a warning to the state that its agents cannot kill without consequences, our silence around the cases of Black women and girls sends the message that certain deaths do not merit repercussions. Please join us in our efforts to advance a gender-inclusive narrative in the movement for Black lives. Another reason it's important to include Black women and girls is to achieve policy reform. Police violence continues to happen to Black women and girls. As Andrea Ritchie describes it, Black women's mere presence, speech, and protest of mistreatment are a threat that officers meet with physical or even deadly force. This must be acknowledged. This must be part of the national discourse. We need this understanding to change the laws, policies, and practices that govern policing. We must say her name. We have to get legal actors to care about what happens to Black women and girls. Black women's interaction with the state through law enforcement is marked by violence. Black women are murdered by the police. They are assaulted and injured by the police. They are arrested unlawfully by the police, and finally they are tried, convicted, and incarcerated for defending themselves against non-police violence. State violence against Black women is long-standing, pervasive, persistent, and multi-layered, yet few legal actors seem to care about it. We have achieved some level of policy reform in Briannas Law.
Last week,
we're here today for one reason only, and that is because of the life and legacy of Miss Breonna Taylor.
With Taylor's family looking on, the Louisville City Council passed Briannas Law, barring the use of no-knock warrants. Attorney Ben Crump represents Taylor's family.
At first, only her mama and her sister was saying her name, but now the whole world is saying Breonna Taylor's name.
In addition to the reform that we're looking for, we generally need to broaden our perception of state violence. Say Her Name is intended to serve as a resource for the media, organizers, researchers, policymakers, and other stakeholders to better understand and address Black women's experiences of profiling and policing. Although Black women are routinely killed, raped, and beaten by the police, their experiences are rarely foregrounded in popular understandings of police brutality, said Crenshaw, director of Columbia Law School's Center for Intersectionality and Social Policy Studies and co-author of the report. Yet, inclusion of Black women's experiences in social movements, media narratives, and policy demands around policing and police brutality is critical to effectively combating racialized state violence for Black communities and other communities of color. In addition to stories of Black women who have been killed by police and who have experienced gender-specific forms of police violence, Say Her Name provides some analytical frames for understanding their experiences and broadens dominant conceptions of who experiences state violence and what it looks like. We need to include Black women and girls to get justice for all.
Fundamentally, we know, as Black women have been telling us for generations, that none of us are free until all of us are free. So freedom and liberation that only includes Black men or Black cisgender folks is not liberation at all. And if we are going to have a conversation about all of the violence that begets our communities, including police violence, then we have to make sure we're clear about how it affects Black women. It most certainly affected Breonna Taylor when she was killed in her bed. It also affects a number of Black women in terms of the sexual violence that they experience at the hands of police. We also recognize that there are so many of our folks, our Black women, both cis and trans, who are essential workers just like Breonna and are experiencing the violence of poverty and wage theft every single day in this country, even more so during coronavirus. I could go on and on and on about all of the ways in which injustices are exacerbated if you are a person who identifies as a woman. That list is never ending, it seems. And so very clearly, we don't get to freedom if we get there without the women. Black women have been the backbone of freedom work. We wouldn't have pride if it weren't for Black trans women. We have to recognize that if we can hold up the movement, then we can be at the center of the conversation too, and we must be.
Hopefully you've learned a lot from this video and you can now understand and explain why we shouldn't use say his name, say their names, or say her name in reference to women who aren't Black. Black women suffer from anti-Black racism and police violence, and we need to do the work of calling that out so that we can include the experiences of Black women in our collective understandings of racism and have a grasp of the very different ways that anti-Black racism can present. I will say, at least according to who I'm following, so what I'm seeing on my timelines and feeds, is that we're in a moment of unprecedented support for Black women and calls to protect Black women and girls. And I think that that's the beginning of a lot of work that needs to be done to unlearn this willful ignorance about the conditions that Black women and girls face. Other intersections are here too. I was talking to one of my friends, Rihanna, about the role that colorism can play in how women experience policing. So that's another dimension. Also, disability really impacts Black people and their interactions with police. So I want to do an entire video on that as well. In closing, thank you for spending time with me. I'll have all my sources in the description, and also I'll leave additional sources that I wasn't able to squeeze into this video so you can peruse those too. I hope to see you soon, and stay safe. Hello and welcome. Hello. The lack of data collect. Accommodation and resistance are two strains that run through Black history. Accommodation and resistance are two strains that run through Black history, and it is. This next scholarly article focuses. There's a long history of. Said Crenshaw, director of Columbia Law School's Center for Intersectionality, and is critical